The real problem now is what happens if we start to see any problems around the Straits of Hormuz, which is where global energy trade flows through. If that were to happen, not a forecast, but if it were, it's not 1% that we would see energy prices increase.
And do you then see this spiralling far beyond the borders of the Middle East?
Well, within the Middle East itself, there's a lot of territory that it can spiral into before we go beyond. But you can clearly see now there are lots and lots of regional players, most of which are under the Iranian umbrella, that are gradually being dragged into this and who may move as one fairly shortly against Israel. And you can see that the US is sending more forces to the region. You can see that Russia has been talking about sending arms to the Houthis, allegedly. And even China recently has been making supportive statements about Iran. So the risk is there again that far more players could become involved in this directly or indirectly.
Let's talk about what it would mean for global markets if this does step up further, keeping in mind that it was only last week we saw a global sell-off in equities.
Absolutely. Well, the recent sell-off that we saw in equities just goes to show how vulnerable our global system is and how a 15 basis point increase in Japan on top of everything else created absolute chaos. So if that already did it, even though we've already unwound a lot of that yen carry trade, that was the underlying cause, if we were, again, not a forecast, but if we were to get a serious blow up in the Middle East, you can expect some enormous volatility. But I think very much in the other direction. The yen would still do well, money would still go back to Japan, but the US dollar would do very well. You'd have a very big risk-off move, and of course oil would go very, very high.
How high?
Well, right now there's a bearish trend in energy, which you have to remember. But even so, if we were to see the worst case scenario where you had Iran and Saudi and those kind of energy complexes being dragged in, you'd have triple figure oil prices almost immediately. And then the question would be, how do we get ourselves out of that mess now we've gotten ourselves into it?
Economists seem divided about the strength of the US economy right now and whether recession is indeed a possibility. What's your view?
It's really hard to say. Genuinely, I know that's an easy get out, but if you look at some of the data, it's still got a lot of heat left in it. If you look at other data, it's pretty cold and cooling rapidly. And I think this is a picture that more and more economies, including Australia, need to learn to live with. We like to talk about GDP and think it's one object. It isn't. It's many different parts, and they can be moving at different speeds and in different directions. And we have to try and find the average, but there may not actually be one that's representative.
Should investors be alarmed if the Federal Reserve, once it begins cutting, as it's expected to in September, cuts by more than 25 basis points?
I think if it did do that, the risk would be, yes, that the markets would think, okay, we've been panicking because we want the Fed to do more. We don't actually expect them to do more, not really, but we want to price that in, because if you price it in, you already get the benefit of it anyway. You're already pushing bond yields down. If the Fed were then to say, well, actually, we think your panic is justified, I think you would get a very strong market reaction in terms of people thinking, what do they know that we don't know they know?
If the US were to enter recession, would the global economy follow?
It always does. The only question is where first, and then how hard everyone else would be hit. But that in itself depends on what the US election result looks like and what economic policies we have starting from January or February next year. That can really overturn the apple cart completely.
Australia's Reserve Bank has indicated it will remain on hold for 6 months, but markets seem to be pretty sure it'll cut sometime this year. What is Rabobank's position?
We think they will cut next, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, but it's pretty much what they want to do, and we have to predict what will happen rather than what should happen. But we don't think it will happen quite that quickly. We think it will be later in 2025.
Michael Every, thank you.
Thank you.